Audience, please rise. Audience, please use the proper hand salute. Color guard, advance.
I did. You see it right.
Color guard, halt. Color guard, post the American flag. Color guard, post the Missouri state flag. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. 2. Audience, you may be seated. Color guard dismissed.
Thank you, Boy Scout Troop 96. Now we will sing the hymn America the Beautiful by the congregation, accompanied by Brother McDonald and accompanied by Sister Marie Harvey. We passed around the sheets that have the words on them. You can follow along.
You want it off?
Now we will hear from Denise Kagan with an honor to our veterans who made the ultimate sacrifice. She will be followed by Emily Anderson singing a solo, The Star Spangled Banner. And after that, Joe Richardson speaking to us on love of our veterans. Mrs. Kagan.
Good morning. We have yet another beautiful day today. I'd like to thank to participate. November the 11th, 2018 will be the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day, the day to end the war that ended all wars. In downtown Kansas City, sitting high above Union Station in Penn Valley Park, you will find the National World War I Museum at the Liberty Memorial. The Liberty Memorial was built in 1926, and in 2006, the National World War Museum, located under the memorial, was opened. Their mission statement reads as follows: the National World War I Museum and Memorial is America's museum dedicated to remembering, interpreting, and understanding the Great War and its enduring impact on the global community. Approaching the entrance to the museum, which sits below ground level, you walk downward past a reflecting pond and over paving bricks, each engraved with the name of someone who served in the Great War. You enter the National World War I Museum through massive doors, leaving bright sunlight behind. Once inside, the lighting is subdued and the atmosphere is reflected. Directly in front of you is a bridge into the main gallery. Light streams in from above the bridge, which is made of glass. As you cross the bridge, beneath the glass, you gaze down at a field of bright red poppies. If you were to count each poppy, you would find there are 9,000 of them, each one representing 1,000 combatants who lost their lives during service in the World War I. The 9,000 poppies are awe-inspiring, and their beauty and the loss of life they represent. Over 116,000 Americans were killed in World War I between 1917 and 1918. And after the war, as in other Allied countries, Americans began wearing the red poppy as the flower of remembrance. The poppy has become synonymous with veterans here in the United States and around the world because of a poem written by Lieutenant Colonel John McCree, a Canadian Army physician who served in the Flanders Field region of Belgium during World War I. The story is told that after the burial of his friend, who died in the Second Battle of Ypres, John McCree noted how the poppies quickly grew around the graves of those buried in the area. The next day, while sitting on the back of an ambulance at an advanced dressing statement outside of Ypres, he wrote the poem, In Flanders Field. In Flanders Field the poppies blow between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, shot days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunsets glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Field. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep though poppies grow in Flanders Field. John McCree's In Flanders Field remains to this day one of the most memorable war poems ever written. It is a lasting legacy of the terrible battle of the Ypres salient in the spring of 1915.
A little shorter than everybody else that's been talking, so I'm just gonna shorten this. Can everybody please rise as we sing the national anthem? say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed, and the town was flashing, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the flowers we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting together, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Oh, thus beacon town, when freemen shall stand between relevant homes and the war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace, may the hand-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. And conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our lot, knowing God is our trust, and the star-spangled banner in triumph shall raise o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
I'm about the same height as Emily. I need to adjust the... So, a couple of years after I enlisted in the National Guard and went through my training, Iraq invaded Kuwait and attempted to annex that country. And we found ourselves at war in the Persian Gulf. And about half of my unit was activated. Everybody that was an interrogator, my MOS was different, and so I didn't go. But about half of our unit went to the Persian Gulf to deploy there. And I remember that there was a lot of public discussion about why we were participating in what seemed to be a regional conflict. And a lot of people in the press were questioning the integrity of the politicians. They were saying, is this just another way to manipulate the price of oil? What's going on here? Why are we sending our young men and young women into harm's way in this conflict? And it wasn't too long after that I was traveling in Europe, and I had the opportunity to go to Mauthausen concentration camp that's in Austria. And a lot of those camps have been preserved to help us. Sorry about that. To help us remember what happened. And I remember walking through these empty barracks and these chambers where people were killed. And in many of the rooms there were, I'm not sure how this technology works. In many of the rooms there were pictures on the wall of people who had died there. They would have a little picture, and next to the picture would be a statement by the family members. And I'm sure not everybody who died was there. There were an estimated about 120,000 to 300,000 people that died in Mauthausen. But I remember row on row of faces. You know, this is my uncle who died here in 1942 or whatever. Rest in peace. And, you know, I thought, it doesn't really matter whether politicians are corrupt. We know a lot of politicians are corrupt. It doesn't matter that the soldiers we send don't always understand some of the global politics. What we did in World War II was necessary. Just as God guided ancient kings, King Cyrus of Persia and Darius and Nebuchadnezzar, to bring to pass his purposes, so does he guide the nations of the earth to bring to pass his purposes. And often he has used this country to even out imbalances, to rectify injustices, to lift up the hands that hang down and strengthen the feeble knees. As a missionary in Italy, I remember encountering a lot of older men who had fought in World War II. And some of them told me of the conditions that they experienced when they were prisoners of war in Russia. And some of them told me of experiences that they had while they were prisoners of war in Africa. And I met some that were prisoners of war in the United States. And they said, we were really disappointed when the war ended. And we had to come home. Because by and large, they were taken care of very well. Especially considering and compared to some of the things that were happening in the prisoner of war camps in their own country. And I remember one older sister in the branch there who couldn't go to church. She was didn't have good enough health. But we would go visit her periodically, and she said, I remember when the Americans first came to our town, and you know, we had just lived through a few years of Mussolini, and we weren't sure what was going to happen when the Americans came. And I remember the tanks coming into the town, and she said I was just a little girl, and I remember peering around the side of this church and seeing these tanks coming. And she said everybody just started cheering. We were so happy. I've been thinking a lot lately about a neighbor that I never knew. growing up, I knew a lot of his nieces and nephews. His niece was my piano teacher. I wasn't a very diligent student, but she was very kind. And his brother was my bishop for a while. I was always kind and nurturing to a little neighborhood kid who wasn't always well-mannered. This is a young man who grew up in Taylorsville, Utah, and served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the eastern states. And he was there at the beginning of the war, World War II. And his mission concluded, and he came home, and he had a beautiful voice. He sang as part of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, and his job was singing at a local radio station. And at a certain point, he was, I don't know if he enlisted or he was drafted, but he ended up somewhere in France. He wrote at the top of this letter, somewhere in France, July 30, 1944.
Hey, Mom!
Dearest folks, today I am enjoying a beautiful Sabbath in a now very peaceful part of the country. It's so glorious to be away from the din of battle for a while and have a chance to clean up to the extent of feeling almost human again. Since I last wrote, something mighty surprising has happened, which will probably sweep you off your feet as it did me. I was made the leader of my squad and have been promoted to the rating of a staff sergeant. Such a responsibility is something I had never imagined would actually happen to me. But every day I realize more and more that it is a reality. Were it not for the faith I have, that the Lord will bless me with the necessary qualifications, I could never have accepted the position. Less than 1 month later, Staff Sergeant Meade Stedman was killed by a grenade blast. Shortly after, his parents received this letter. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Stedman, I have recently been advised that your son, Sergeant Meade S. Stedman, gave his life, well, in the service of his country. I realize, of course, that no word from me can do much to relieve the pangs of sorrow which his sacrifice has brought to you. Nevertheless, I desire to extend to you my deepest sympathy and best wishes. I know that I express the sentiments of the people of this state when I say that we are proud of the record made by your son. It should be a source of satisfaction for you to remember that he gave his life in the service of his fellow men, that he did well his part in the fight to preserve for future generations the right to live in freedom and to enjoy justice. The sacrifice made by him and now being made by you will inspire the rest of us to carry on. Unfortunately, that wasn't a very uncommon occurrence in the history of this nation. About 1.3 million people have given their life for our freedom and for the freedom of people around the world. An additional 1.5 were wounded in conflict, and many others bore and continue to bear permanent, lifelong scars. On this day, we typically fly a flag at half staff to to remember the sacrifice of these men and women on our behalf. And we do that until noon. Then we raise the flag to its full height. One, to recognize veterans who are still living and who have served in behalf of our country, in behalf of us, and also to signal our own commitment to ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain and that their lives were not wasted. Their actions are for us what we could call a pivot point, a fulcrum point in our history that give us the opportunity to choose, to experience something different than what might otherwise have been if they had not sacrificed their lives. So it is up to us at that point to determine what we will do. We can enjoy the freedoms that they made possible and ignore the cost and ignore the effects of our everyday choices, or that we can honor their sacrifice by honoring and valuing the privilege to choose and to allow others the same choice. At this time, I would like to also recognize and honor the ultimate sacrifice that gives us the chance to choose, the opportunity for freedom and life. The sacrifice of our Lord Jesus Christ. And I pray that we might always remember Him and the liberty wherewith He has made us free. And I say this in His name, Jesus Christ, amen.